Okay, we're talking about The Street Fighter, released in Japan in 1974, directed by Shigehiro Ozawa. The plot of The Street Fighter, imagine if in a Western film, as in Western made, you had a story about a guy who's an underworld figure, a criminal who has skills that are useful to higher up underworld people. For instance, you could take a pug boxer who knows his way around beating the living crap out of people. You could send him off to kill assorted individuals, steal certain objects, etc., and so forth. So this is a form we're familiar with. Now, with The Street Fighter, take this and transplant it to 1974 Japan. And what we have here is a head-on collision between a crime and exploitation film with liberal lashings of very sloppily administered and quite nasty karate fighting. So find me one thing wrong with that, all right? So The Street Fighter was a grindhouse perennial for a number of reasons, but the basic plot of the film is how we have this extremely antisocial, bitter, and hyper-violent criminal guy who is hired by various underworld forces to do various things. And in this case, we initially see him sneaking into a prison where a condemned man is about to be executed. Through various means, he gets that man out and sends that man away to China, where he's going to be put up until things blow over in Japan. The people who hired our hero to do this are the man's younger brother and sister, whom, when they show up to say, "Where is our brother?" find out that the brother is no longer in the country. Then our hero finds out that they no longer have the money that he needs to be paid. So he proposes putting the sister on the street as a prostitute. The younger brother does not quite agree with this. So the two of them get into a massive fight. Our hero, played by Sonny Chiba, the one and only Sonny Chiba, I might add, ends up inadvertently throwing the younger brother out of a 30-story window, so he ends up as a street pizza. Meanwhile, the younger sister is immediately pressed into service as a prostitute and shipped off to Hong Kong, where she is, of course, promptly gang raped and addicted to heroin. So we're not exactly dealing with a family film here, kids. So anyway, the main thrust of the plot, and this is after all the stuff I just told you about, which establishes the fact that we're not dealing with your usual martial arts virtuous hero, he ends up being tasked by the local mafia and Yakuza to go and kidnap a girl who's the heiress to a vast oil fortune. They want to get her to sign over the rights to her oil fortune so they can have all the money. Makes sense. But what they don't count on is our hero, for no apparent reason, turning down their request. And it turns out the reason he doesn't want to take the job is she's being guarded by a guy who, we later find out, was his father's best friend, and the two of them were advanced martial thinkers for their time. And our hero's father sought to combine Okinawan karate with Chinese kung fu, which is, when we see our hero fight, it's a blend of, sort of a blend of those things. If you know your martial arts for real, it's clearly some oddball form of mutated karate for the purposes of the film. But our hero then decides that he's going to prove to the karate badasses who are guarding the young lady that he's the kind of dangerous piece of human vermin who can really handle these criminals on their own terms. So the rest of the film is our hero making attempts at guarding this girl, and he's not very good at it. She gets kidnapped a couple of times, and he ends up getting into numerous fights with various people as a result of this, and it's all a question of how he's going to eventually triumph and rescue her, while also in some ways redeeming himself as a worthy human being. Now, I'm proud to say that, unlike a lot of martial arts films of the time, there's really nothing redeeming about this character. He's a badass, or as Quentin Tarantino in his film True Romance mentions when he goes off at length about Sonny Chiba, Chiba's character isn't so much of a hero as he is just a bad motherfucker. And that's it. I mean, this is a guy who, if you've seen a lot of martial arts movies, you know for a fact you don't want to fight any of the characters who are in those films for various reasons. For instance, Bruce Lee. He was an amazing martial artist. There's no denying that. But when you got your ass kicked by Bruce Lee, it was the kind of thing where you wouldn't mind getting your ass kicked by him because it was just so beautifully and surgically applied, that ass kicking. Yeah. Whereas with Sonny Chiba, if he kicks your ass, it's going to hurt. and he wants you to hurt. And it's very clear on his face and in his body language. He is an embodiment of rage. And just, we find out the causes of his rage over the course of the film, but in watching him administer physical mayhem, it's at the same time for the audience cathartic as it is utterly horrifying. Because one of the things I haven't really explained about this is, unlike a lot of other martial arts films, this character, if he fights you, there are tons of horrible sound effects of bones and cartilage being destroyed, teeth being knocked out left and right, usually accompanied with vast gouts of Kool-Aid blood. We also get eyeballs ripped out, a man's naughty bits being torn off in a rather spectacular fashion. It is brutality. In fact, let's go so far as to say it's the martial arts movie equivalent of having your face stuffed face first into a meat grinder. The Foley work on this film, and for those of you who don't know what Foley is, that's the sound effects that help to bring the film to life and punctuate its various visceral qualities. There are moments in this where, worse than what you're actually seeing in terms of the physical violence, the sound effects send it right over the top. There's a bit where Chiba's character fights two men who are both armed. He quickly disarms both of them, one of whom he leaps into the air, punches straight down atop the man's head, and the shot shifts to an X-ray, and you see the top of the man's head cave in. It then cuts back to regular view, and we see the guy get a blank look on his face because he's now brain dead, and he spews a mouthful of Kool-Aid blood. So you hear that horrible cave-in of the skull sound effect with this but as he's lying there dead on the ground, Chiba walks over to another guy who he incapacitated, takes a stance atop the man's hip, and you see him put all of his body weight with great emphasis into the guy's hip, and you hear the man's hip caving in, and I swear to God, it sounds exactly like somebody doing unspeakable things to mounds of celery. I mean, when you hear it, you feel it, and that's part of that is part of the visceral power of this film. I grew up as a kid during the whole martial arts boom of the 70s, and I've always found the martial arts interesting. I've practiced. I love the whole human violent ballet of the whole thing, especially when done as an entertainment form. And the Street Fighter was at the time unique among those films because it was about savagery, and it was a Japanese attempt at doing their take on what they would perceive a Bruce Lee movie to be. For instance, Sonny Chiba had made martial arts films before the Street Fighter. However, he did not have the savage, brooding, violent persona that he displays in the Street Fighter as the main character, Terry Tsurugi. Now, when seeing this in the US at the time, it was something of a revelation because it was shortly after the first two big martial arts films from China hit in the US, namely Five Fingers of Death, which is credited as launching the whole martial arts boom in the US, and Enter the Dragon with Bruce Lee, which is a film classic, as everyone knows. Now, there was a huge glut of these films coming out because everybody wanted to be the next one to cash in on the whole Bruce Lee boom, and Bruce, by that point, was dead. So everybody was trying to come up with the next Bruce Lee, and Sonny Chiba's character in the Street Fighter is very clearly modeled after the Bruce Lee yowling Avenger sort of persona.
Force of nature, guy ripped that
exactly.
out. Yeah.
However, it's with that sort of badassery cranked up several notches, and it resonates with me simply because I was so used to seeing all these films where the martial arts hero was such a virtuous figure and who was willing to lay down his life for his family, his school, his community. No such altruism coming out of Terry Tsurugi, believe me. And when the film was released in the US, it was so violent and bloody, it was the very first film in the United States to be rated X for violence. And unfortunately, at the time, you couldn't run an X-rated movie in any theater other than a pornography venue. And do you think that the porn audience wants to see people getting ripped apart? Well, they might want to see people getting ripped apart, but not in that particular way.
Split down the center.
Yeah. Yes. But so the film had to be taken out of distribution where it was crudely recut so that all of the fight scenes were pretty much taken out. The film itself is only about 87 minutes long, but when it was taken out and re-edited, 16 minutes of footage were cut out.
Wow.
So it renders the fight scenes virtually incomprehensible. A fight would start and stop. And I remember seeing that on video, on home video, VHS back in the days, and going, well, where are all the damn fights? I've heard nothing but how brutal and horrible this movie was, and I'm not getting anything. But when I saw the film in that edited form, the story was so strong and the characters were so interesting, it almost didn't matter that I was getting ripped off out of the, these fight scenes. But years later, a friend of mine who is one of the country's experts on martial arts films, he had a friend who was living in Japan who got his hands on a Laserdisc copy of the uncut version of the film. So they took the VHS home copy from the US and managed to edit together a more or less uncut reconstruction of the film. And this was before Quentin Tarantino got his hands on it and re-released it once Pulp Fiction was out and he was powerful enough to do so. So I finally saw it uncut, and it was a whole different experience. And ever since then, it has stuck with me as perhaps the most visceral martial arts film I've ever seen, before or since. And it's the kind of thing that resonates with my own now dealt with anger issues. But it's the honesty of the film is refreshing because it has nothing on its mind other than entertaining the audience and being as in your face brutal fuck you up as possible. And it's damn proud of it. I first saw it, I'd have to say, in the edited form, around 1985.
So it's already 11, 12 years old by that point.
Right. And it was something of a legend, but unfortunately at that point when I saw it, the uncut version was believed to be long gone. And of course nobody really considered, hey, wait a minute, doesn't this film exist in its uncut form in Japan? So it was a long time coming before anyone really got to see the uncut version again. When and where I grew up, I grew up in Westport, Connecticut, and I was one of 0.02 black people there. So, you kind of had to learn stuff, and I started taking judo when I was 8, and it progressed from there to various other things. But at the time, I was too young for Bruce Lee at that point, and in America, right after, some would say a direct fallout from Bruce Lee, but they're not really taking into account that this happened sort of before his death. Kung Fu with David Carradine was big on TV, and the pilot movie, if I'm getting my dates right, the pilot movie of Kung Fu happened about a year before Bruce Lee died. And that show was also developed with Bruce Lee in mind as the star, but at the last minute, the networks figured America was not ready for an Asian leading man. Mm-hmm. Despite the fact that Bruce Lee had already been on television in The Green Hornet.
Yeah, right.
So anyway, I'm kind of glad he didn't do Kung Fu anyway, because he ended up making his own movies, and those are now part of the indelible film language. But I was too young for Bruce Lee, but I was into the Kung Fu show, and even though it was very obvious that the hero was not a Chinese guy, or a half Chinese as he's described in the show, but years later, around 1981, I want to say, New York City's Channel 5 on Saturday afternoons had a showcase devoted to martial arts movies called Drive-In Theater, and it was a nationwide syndicated package where they would run assorted martial arts films, most of which were films from the Shaw Brothers studios out of Hong Kong. And the Shaw Brothers films, in my opinion, are the best martial arts films ever made, just because they're visually beautiful, they have great production values.
They're Technicolor practically.
Yeah, they're beautiful colors. And the martial arts themselves are all done by people who knew what they were doing and were phenomenal filmmakers and choreographers. So I got really hooked at that point when I was in high school, and a lot of other friends of mine who were of the same age who had no interest in martial arts discovered Drive-In Theater and would watch it every week. Never underestimate the power of the appeal of martial arts movies to us highly rhythmic individuals. Believe me, black people and Hispanic people, we eat those movies up like there is no tomorrow.
But you got into it before Wu-Tang came around.
Oh, fuck Wu-Tang. Are you kidding? It's like black people got into that stuff long before. Where do you think Wu-Tang got it? I mean, come on. And you know,
They just made money off of it.
there exactly. Yeah. But when Five Fingers of Death came out in 1972 or 73, you know, it opened in inner city theaters in places like Detroit and whatever, and the distributors in the U.S., I think Warner Brothers distributed it over here, were shocked as hell to find out that there were lines around the block to see that film. And if, for those of you out there who may be watching this, if you haven't seen Five Fingers of Death, it's available on DVD. Watch it immediately. And it's available under the title of its original title, King Boxer. Highly recommended. Sonny Chiba was already a star before the Street Fighter. Oh, yeah. He'd been kicking around in Japanese films and television since the early 60s. He originally was training as an athlete. Specifically, he wanted to be an Olympic gymnast, but there was some sort of injury that prevented him from competing in whatever year Olympics that was. I want to say was 62. But anyway, he concentrated instead on film and television, and he had considerable martial arts training, became a star via television first on a show called Key Hunter, Key Hunter, which was sort of a Japanese answer to Mission Impossible. And then,
awesome.
Yeah, I'd love to see it. All I've ever seen is opening sequences and things like that, but it's pretty much not, it's never been shown in the US as far as I know. By the time the Street Fighter came around, Chiba had already made a name for himself, and he was making martial arts films, like a film called Karate Kiba, which got released over here as The Bodyguard, among others. But the Street Fighter is, because of its in-your-face, crazy violence and gore, is what put him on the map in the US. And that's also, in case you don't know, where we get the slang term Chiba for smoking weed. Yeah. Okay? Because, much like Sonny Chiba, really good weed will kick your fucking ass. Years ago, when I got out of college, I was still living at home in Connecticut for about a year and a half, and there were still friends of mine from high school who still lived in the area themselves, and my mom's house was sort of the general meeting place for myself and my friends. And late at night, they'd come over and we'd hang out in the downstairs area, and that was kind of our little clubhouse and screening room. And at the time, and I'm going to be honest about this because, let's face it, I'm never going to run for friggin' president, we would load the place up with as much liquor and weed as we possibly could, and we would recreate the atmosphere of Venus. I mean, you could barely see anything in there. So we had the TV going. We'd watch all sorts of cult movies and things like that, and also a number of my crew were fellow martial artists, so we, of course, grooved on martial arts movies. And when I got my hands on The Street Fighter, I said to them, guys, this is a film that we should all see because I've heard a million things about it, how violent and brutal and horrible it is, and at this point, none of us had seen a Sonny Chiba movie before. So we threw in the VHS copy, and this was, I think, Warner Brothers had it out. This was the edited copy. And we were all quite annoyed at the fact that there was no trace of the legendary violence and gore of the film, yet we were all enthralled by Chiba's persona and his charisma as this human buzzsaw, and we also liked the story. So we all agreed, one of these days, we're going to have to see this uncut. And when I got my hands on the uncut version, I staged a screening much like it used to be held in my mother's basement, complete with loads of weed and loads of booze. And we watched the film, and it was as though a piece of the puzzle was finally added to the overall picture. And it made sense. So it also was interesting because where we grew up in Connecticut, we had a couple of grindhouse movie theaters, and we saw our fair share of sleazy cinema, but nothing like that ever played there. And we knew that it was a grindhouse perennial back in the days, and we longed for the days when grindhouses near us would show material like that. We used to get lots of the TNA women in prison movies, assorted gory horror and things like that, but the only martial arts films we got were those really bad ones Golan Globus were putting out, things like Enter the Ninja and all that crap. So we discovered Chiba via home video while smoking a lot of Chiba. So it was a match made in heaven, really. If you were the kind of fanatical collector that I am, part of the thrill was trying to track down these foreign films in their original versions, and unfortunately, since it was only VHS at that point, you would not be able to find these things with subtitles. For instance, I was really into anime at one point, and all the stuff that I was interested in tended to be pretty violent and would never be seen over here in its uncut form in those days. So I would go to a place that I don't know if it still exists near Grand Central, Tokyo Video, and I would buy VHS tapes from them of the latest episodes of these shows that I liked watching as they aired on Japanese television. And they would also occasionally have dubbed by transferred, copies of anime films and whatever else I was looking for that would not be seen over here for years to come, but no translation. And you kind of got used to it. The Street Fighter is very much, in so much as a film like The Searchers is an uber American film, John Ford, Western, John Wayne. The Street Fighter at its heart is a very Japanese film. And for those who don't understand the Japanese as a culture and as a people, what we Americans misread about the Japanese, sometimes we see them as these a stoic society of automatons, which is not exactly, and that is not what they are at all. And if anything, they're a deeply emotional people, and the Street Fighter is about as emotional of a martial arts movie as you're going to find. In fact, the histrionics in it it'll just drag you into the film whether you want to be dragged into it or not. It's no bullshit when engaging most of the emotions that the human soul is capable of feeling. Whether or not it's an exploitation film, which it most definitely is, it resonates on many levels because you have this psychologically damaged individual who's the protagonist, who is admittedly the best at what he does, but what he does is just so appalling, and he has a certain amount of self-loathing, which is examined in the story, and he eventually, in his own haphazard way, decides to prove that he's more of a man than most people that he works for think that he really is. Part of our hero's self-loathing comes from him being the offspring of a Japanese karate fighter and a Chinese mother, and he was born actually just prior to World War II, and we see some of the injustices that went on then, and his father, for marrying a Chinese woman, was declared a traitor to the Japanese cause, and he's executed in front of his young son's eyes. So there was no love lost between the Japanese and the Chinese during World War II. This is all in the film.
Awesome.
This is all in the film, and unfortunately in the sequels, the two sequels, that sequence is repeated verbatim so they didn't have to shoot anything else. But anyway, the hero of the film sees himself as something of an animal, and let's face it, the things that he does are animalistic, and the people who hire him for his talents at being an awful human being. In fact, a Yakuza head even tells him to his face, "You're just about the meanest son of a bitch I've ever met." So he has no self-esteem other than in his ability to be a violent killing machine. And finally, when he is put in a position of defending this girl who's under the protection of his father's best friend, he starts to reevaluate what his life has been all about. And even though he does this in terms of beating the living shit out of people who really deserve it, he nonetheless tries to redeem himself in his own eyes and inadvertently in the eyes of others as a man. And the one thing I neglected to mention is the girl that he sold into prostitution, she's under the care of a Chinese drug lord who is also a martial artist, and that drug lord is getting old, and he's starting to think about who will replace me when I'm old. And he starts seeing Sonny Chiba's character as having more moxie and general decency than even he believes. So there's a strong consideration that Chiba's character might take over for this guy after the events of the film. But as we see in the sequels, which are, quite frankly, not worth seeing, that doesn't happen. Well, the film is set in 1974, give or take, and this was also at the height of the blaxploitation era. And in many ways, the Street Fighter bears a lot of the earmarks of blaxploitation movies. In fact, as those of you who've seen Shaft, the soundtrack is indelible with its classic Waka Jawaka music, and the Street Fighter is rife with the Japanese take on waka music. In fact, when you see it, you won't be able to get the theme tune out of your head for weeks. I mean, it's that kind of you trust me on this. But the film was also made just as the energy crisis was getting started, so the MacGuffin about the oil baroness and her oil fortune, that was very much a topical thing at the time. And also, quite frankly, the exploitation cinema of that era was of a piece with what the Street Fighter was trying to do, or more accurately, the filmmakers of the Street Fighter were tapping into that vein of exploitation and sleazy adventure thrills, while also in many ways riding on the coattails of Bruce Lee's success, specifically with his Enter the Dragon persona.